The pair never left New York City and would move locations every few months.
Lepke wanted, dead or alive. Launching a nationwide search for America's new public enemy #1, Louis Buchalter, alias Lepke, the big city's most feared racketeer.
The publicity Lepke so desperately avoided now escalated with his disappearance.
They're looking for him. He's all over the United States. There's this manhunt going on. Then the public knows about him. It's written up in Newsweek. It's written up in Time magazine. Where's Lepke? Who's Lepke? And then it comes out who this man is and what he's been doing.
Overnight, the price on his head jumped to $25,000. 20 New York police detectives were assigned to the manhunt. The FBI sent out a worldwide bulletin. Priority: find fugitive Lepke Buchalter.
The rumor was that he had fled. He'd fled to Palestine. He had fled to Europe. They figured anywhere, Poland, wherever Jews were living, they figured he was running away to. And actually, he was in Brooklyn the whole time.
For 6 months, he lived in a room with only a cot and a hot plate above the Oriental Palace movie theater on Coney Island. He grew a mustache and gained 40 pounds. Lepke fit right in with the throngs of New Yorkers who came to spend a day at the beach. In March 1938, a music publisher who had the misfortune to look like a mob contact of Lepke's was murdered in Brooklyn. This killing led prosecutor Dewey to take to the newsreels with a warning for Lepke.
And now, a respectable citizen has been killed by bullets apparently intended for another Lepke associate. Lepke must be found, dead or alive.
It was all too much for Garage Shapiro. Facing health problems, he gave himself up on April 14, 1938. As he was led away, he told reporters, "I got a bad reputation from the newspapers. They arrest me because they want to be district attorney or even governor."
My grandfather took the rap for Lepke, and he went to the can first. Lepke said, "Don't worry, Gara, I'll take care of your family. Just, you won't have to serve that much time." And Lepke said, "I'll handle everything." So Gara said, "Fine, I need a vacation. I'll go in for a little while."
Lepke kept his promise. He ordered his men to give Gara's wife $1 million and titles to 3 of his legitimate clothing businesses. By June of 1939, Lepke's colleagues in the Jewish and Italian underworld had finally had enough. Lepke's murderous spree was becoming dangerous to them. Plus, Dewey's men were leaning on the bosses to give Lepke up.
It became uncomfortable for everyone. And what happened was that the governing body, the bosses, decided this is really bad for business. And they began to feel that he was going off the deep end.
Lepke got the word from an old friend, Moe Dimples Walensky. The bosses had decided he had to surrender.
As powerful as he may have been, he would not be able to oppose all of the bosses, and they were unified in the notion that they had to stop this pressure from being put on them.
On orders from the mob bosses, Walensky told Lepke a lie. If he surrendered to the FBI, he said the feds would go easy on him and arrange for Dewey not to prosecute him in New York. After almost 2 years on the run, the 42-year-old Lepke was exhausted. He bought the lie.
He was the kind of man who believed that everything is corrupt and you can make deals with anybody, and especially the people highest up, if you get to them in a certain way.
His surrender would be one of the most dramatic in law enforcement history. He told his friend and fellow gangster Albert Anastasia to make an anonymous call to radio personality Walter Winchell. Lepke knew about Winchell's close relationship to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and both men's appetite for publicity. On August 24, 1939, at the corner of Madison and 23rd Street, a black sedan pulled alongside a limousine carrying Hoover. Inside the sedan were Winchell, Lepke, and the driver, Anastasia. In a radio broadcast, Winchell later recalled what happened next.
As I opened the door of Mr. Hoover's car, I said, "Lepke, this is Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover, this is Lepke." Mr. Hoover said to his driver, "Foley Square. That's where the Federal Building is." Then Mr. Hoover couldn't resist saying, "Where are all your high and mighty and influential friends now, Mr. Buchalter?" Lepke, looking at the floor of the car, said, "I'm beginning to wonder."
Once in federal custody, Lepke realized that he had been double-crossed. There was no deal. Within a few months, the feds turned him over to Dewey, who swiftly indicted him for racketeering in the bakery industry. Now, the mob betrayal of Lepke was complete. He was convicted on 19 counts of racketeering and sentenced to 30 years in state prison. Lepke had finally been defeated. His wife Betty and their son moved out of their plush apartment. She returned to her parents' home in Queens and used money Lepke had given her to open a hat shop in Manhattan. Lepke had vowed he'd never return to prison, and here he was, back in Sing Sing. Then he got more bad news. He would have to stand trial again, this time for murder. As Lepke Buchalter neared the end of his first year in prison in 1940, he was charged with the murder of trucker Joseph Rosen. The indictment threw an already depressed Lepke into a tailspin. He was transferred to the West Street House of Detention in Manhattan. His wife Betty would visit her husband weekly, faithfully telling him news of his family. But Lepke, desperate for more companionship, sought out a pal behind bars. He befriended a 21-year-old pacifist named Donald Wetzel. Wetzel had been charged with avoiding the draft that had begun that year.
He came directly to my cell and stood there looking at me. Finally he came and took the cell bars and leaned very close and in a very low voice asked me, "Are you a Yid?" I caught the inflection. I knew I had been asked if I was a Jew.
Wetzel, knowing Lepke's violent reputation, nodded yes, even though he was not Jewish.
He said, and turned away in disgust. And I realized that a Jew should not be a pacifist.
Even so, the two struck up a friendship. Lepke would visit with Wetzel every day and take comfort in their purported religious connection.
It mattered to him that I was a Jew. He knew he was in trouble. In fact, when he accepted me as a Jew, he talked about a Jewish background that I thought he knew nothing about.
Months passed as prosecutors delayed Lepke's murder trial. Finally, on September 1st, 1941, Lepke, along with Murder Incorporated gunmen Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, no relation to Al, went on trial for Joseph Rosen's murder. Try as he might, Lepke had not killed every potential witness against him. There was one man who had escaped the bullets of Murder Incorporated. Max Rubin, a former Union ally of Lepke's, had been shot at close range in the back of the head nearly 3 years earlier and miraculously survived. When Rubin entered the courtroom, Lepke slumped in his chair and muttered, "You." On the stand, Rubin testified that he was in the same room when Lepke ordered the hit on Joseph Rosen back in 1936. On November 15th, the case went to the jury. While the jury deliberated, Lepke got word that the feds were taking away his newfound friend. Donald Wetzel was being transferred to a work camp in upstate New York. On Wetzel's last day in the jail, a distraught Lepke came to say goodbye.
He became emotional. It showed in his face, and he said shalom, which I understood meant peace.
2 weeks later, Lepke and his co-defendants were found guilty of murder. On December 6th, one day before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the sentence for all three, death in Sing Sing's electric chair. Lepke walked out of the courtroom looking tired but confident. He blew a kiss to his wife and gave her a smile. A week later, he was transferred to the death house at Sing Sing. His execution was set for January 1942, less than a month away. That's when Lepke came up with an idea he hoped would save his life. The idea involved former Union boss Sidney Hillman, who was now President Roosevelt's labor czar. Hillman was the man responsible for allocating industrial resources toward the war effort. Lepke, through his attorney, planted rumors in Washington newspapers of underworld deals made in the 1930s with Hillman. Among those reading about the rumors was Tom Dewey, who was now governor of New York. Dewey was planning to run against FDR in 1944. Lepke might have some dirt on the president, and Dewey had the power to commute Lepke's death sentence.
Tom Dewey scented in this rumored information a great political opportunity. He was a presidential aspirant, and he knew that damaging information of this sort about Sidney Hillman would damage the Roosevelt administration.
The election was nearly 2 years away, and Dewey was in no hurry to make a deal. So the governor let Lepke sweat it out, while the gangster's attorneys worked feverishly and successfully to delay the execution. 2 years later, in early 1944, a New York judge gave Lepke a new date in the electric chair, March 2nd. Dewey knew the time was right to offer Lepke a deal. He sent word that he would consider commuting Lepke's sentence to life imprisonment for the right information. In late February, Dewey dispatched an emissary to Lepke's cell. The governor was anxious to see what information the master of racketeering would divulge. But Lepke kept tight-lipped and gave no details about his shady relationship with Hillman. He had decided that Dewey's deal was not good enough.
He had nothing to gain, because what reprieve would they have given him? Just they would have commuted the death sentence. That's the only possibility. But he would have spent the rest of his life in jail anyway.
Lepke would rather die. His wife Betty held impromptu press conferences throughout February 1944, declaring her husband's innocence. Then, on March 1st, she and son Harold went to the death house at Sing Sing to say a final goodbye. On March 2nd, Lepke remained his trademark calm, still expecting a last-minute miracle. A 24-hour delay came from the U.S. Supreme Court. It wanted to review Lepke's conviction.
Even to the very last, he said, don't worry, the fix is in. It's not going to be carried out. And as a matter of fact, there was a delay. And he said to them, according to witnesses that were there, the police that were there, he said, you see? He says, but don't worry about it.
The next morning, March 3rd, Lepke got the bad news from the High Court. No change. He would be put to death that night. He ordered his last meal, roasted chicken, shoestring potatoes, and a Coke. For dessert, cheesecake. Gilbert Milstein, a reporter for the New York Daily News, was at Sing Sing that night.
They pushed him, and I mean pushed him, into the execution room, and there was no expression on his face at all. You might have thought he was going to a soda fountain.
The 5'6", 160-pound master of racketeering, barefoot, with his head shaved, was strapped in the chair. Then, at 11:52, the switch was thrown.
You knew only when the body stiffened a little and smoke came out of here and here that he was being executed.
8 minutes later, at midnight on March 4th, Louis Lepke Buchalter, age 47, industrial racketeer, murderer, husband and father, was pronounced dead. Ironically, he was buried just 50 yards from a part of this New York cemetery devoted to Union employees, the very people he had exploited to build his fortune. A fortune estimated at $50 million at the time of his death. In the decades to come, the underworld would earn untold millions more by copying the crimes that Lepke had pioneered.
I think he was a very highly intelligent, well-organized, sort of almost bureaucrat of criminal enterprise, you know, who brought to it a kind of impersonal, business-like, organizational sense that